Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. My name is Ed Pritchard, and I work for Miami-Dade County Miami Eco Adventures. This webinar series is a joint effort between my organization, IFAS Extension, and Florida Sea Grant. We will be offering this webinar series every Friday at 1 p.m. and 5 p.m. until the end of this month, whereupon we will be moving to a new schedule which we will be informing everyone of once finalized. Although we can't see you all in person right now, we're very excited to offer this webinar series and reach even more people than we'd normally be able to in one classroom. So thanks so much for tuning in today. Currently everyone is muted, so I ask that you guys type any questions that you might have throughout the presentation into the chat box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. We will answer the questions at the end of the session. I'll be moderating that throughout. This webinar is being recorded today, and a link to the recording will be sent out probably within the next day. If you don't already, please follow us on social media, where we will be announcing the week's conservation topic, usually at the beginning of the week. So if you'd like to receive an email reminder with that week's conservation conversation topic, along with the registration links, please email Anna, who just put her email address in the chat box, or you can let us know later on in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to today's presenter, Anna Zangroniz.
All right, thank you so much, Ed. I appreciate that intro. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this gorgeous second Friday of June. We're here today to talk about the excitement of mangroves. And we're going to be focusing specifically on the biology and ecology of mangroves. As Ed mentioned, I'm Anna Zangroniz, and I'm the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent here in Miami-Dade County. And it's my job to deliver scientific information to coastal and marine user groups who live here. And so that's how we tie in with this program, and I work a lot with Miami Eco Adventures to deliver these programs. And I first want to start you all out with just a simple exercise and ask you, what do you think of when you see this photograph? And please go ahead and just type your thoughts on the screen. They can be single words, they can be phrases. Whatever you think, whatever comes to mind when you see an image of a tree or a plant that looks like this.
So we have, Michael says biodiversity. That's good. Anyone else?
No takers? I expected at least.
Oh, we got adaptations and almost alien-like.
Oh, nice. Very cool. I was expecting perhaps someone to say mosquitoes, which would have been cool as well. All right, thanks for responding, guys. Good. I want you to keep all of those thoughts in mind as we move through this. And biodiversity, adaptations, and alien-like are all three really great descriptors for mangroves. Thank you for participating. So we're going to start out with thinking about what is a mangrove. And the term mangrove expresses two distinct concepts. The first use of the term encompasses the entire plant community, including individual mangrove species. And this is often referred to as a mangrove forest, ecosystem, swamp, community, etc. The second term refers to the species of trees or woody plants that grow in saline soils. And in this sense, the term mangrove is a catch-all. It's a botanically diverse, non-taxonomic expression given to approximately 12 families and more than 50 species of tropical trees and shrubs. Now, if we look around the world, you'll start to see that mangroves are tropical trees that live in the calm, intertidal areas where temperatures generally do not drop below freezing for extended periods of time. And you think about calm intertidal areas, they're pretty close to shore. They're not out in the middle of the ocean for the most part. They have a circumglobal distribution with the majority of their populations falling between the latitudes of 30 degrees north and south. And the determining factors for the location of mangroves are warm currents. If we zoom in and look a little more closely, we'll see that here in Florida, we generally have mangroves on the East Coast from about St. Augustine and south, and on the West Coast from Cedar Key or the Big Bend area and south. The most mangroves that we have are located in the 10,000 Islands area in Florida Bay, which are over here on the Gulf Coast. You'll see that there are two squares here up in the Panhandle region. Those are indications of black mangroves being spotted. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that is outside of what is considered to be their normal or historical range. And this map also makes reference to the button mangrove, which is not technically correct, but buttonwood is actually a mangrove associate species, and I'll talk more about that in just a few moments. All in all, there are about 500,000 acres of mangroves in Florida. These trees and shrubs reside in the intertidal areas or boundary zone on the edge of land and sea, or low energy zones. While they're found in the tropics and subtropics, their distribution is dependent on four major factors, including climate, saltwater, tidal fluctuation, and soil type. The mangrove's tidal environment is harsh with anaerobic sediments, meaning no oxygen, fluctuating water levels, and high salt content. Mangroves favor these conditions not because they can't live in fresh water, but because fewer species are able to live in this environment, so there's less ecological competition. Unlike freshwater plants, mangroves thrive in their habitat because of evolved adaptations in their root structure, reproductive strategies, and their ability to maintain a salt balance. Surprisingly, individual species have evolved different solutions to deal with the same challenges. Here in Florida, we have three true mangrove species. We have the red mangrove, the black mangrove, and the white mangrove. Now I'm going to ask Ed to launch a little poll question for me, asking you all to guess what type of mangrove is depicted in this painting. So once he gets that poll up on the screen, please use your mouse to make a selection. Don't worry if you're sure or unsure, just go with your best guess as to what type of mangrove you think is on the screen. A white mangrove, a red mangrove, a black mangrove, or a buttonwood. And we'll give it about 10 more seconds. All right, Ed, you can go ahead and conclude that. For everyone who participated, thank you. Those of you who chose black mangrove, you are correct. Great job. And I just want to take a moment and acknowledge that this was a painting done by my brother who had never seen a mangrove before in his life and saw this black mangrove along the Rickenbacker Causeway and took a photograph of it and loved it so much and was so fascinated by the root system that he decided to paint it. And so I really wanted to feature it in this presentation. Let's talk about different techniques to use to identify, mangroves. Sorry about that, guys. We're going to look at a couple different ways to figure this out. One of the major clues is looking at the morphology or structure of the roots. And we're also going to talk about the leaf shape as well. Something that's important to note about mangroves is that the leaves of true mangroves are opposite of one another, whereas associated species like the buttonwood have leaves that alternate. And this is a really easy giveaway. This is a really strong clue of knowing whether you're looking at a mangrove versus an associate species. First, we're going to start with the red mangrove or Rhizophora mangle. These are pretty charismatic here in Florida. These are what a lot of people think of and know when they hear the word mangrove, and they can grow to about 60 or 65 feet tall. These mangroves grow best in areas with good water flushing, and they're typically found lower than the mean high water line. Red mangroves usually grow out further in the water than other mangroves and are almost always flooded at high tide. They can root on intertidal surfaces such as oyster beds and sandbars, forming little mangrove islands. Red mangroves are easily identified by their tall, arching roots, or as someone said, it looks alien-like. These roots are called prop roots or aerial roots, and that gives them this appearance as though they're walking on water. These roots are adapted to supply air to the underground roots by way of pores along the root structures called lenticels. These roots also add to the stability of the trees. Red mangroves are salt excluders and obtain fresh water by blocking the absorption of salt at the roots. Next, we have the black mangrove or Avicennia germinans. The black mangroves grow closer to the shore where they are reached only by high tides. At the northern edge of their range, St. Augustine on the east coast and Cedar Key on the Gulf Coast, these trees are small and shrub-like. Larger trees up to about 50 feet tall with a branch spread of 35 feet are found further south around the Sanibel Captiva area on the Gulf Coast. Their major root giveaway in terms of identification are these little peg roots that are called nematophores. And these nematophores work to provide oxygen to a submerged cable root system. So you can think of these like a snorkel. They're providing air to what's below. They have a fun nickname of dead man's fingers if you want to channel your imagination in that way. And they're really, really cool. And these are the roots that inspired my brother to paint the image that you saw just a few moments ago. The leaves of the black mangrove are another key for identification. They are less thick and waxy than the red mangrove leaves, but they also tend to be lighter green and even have a silverish white color on them. And that's because black mangroves are salt excretors, and they are actually pushing salt and excreting it through their leaves. An easy memory clue to help remember the black mangrove is thinking black, black, salt on back. And you can actually even lick the mangrove leaves to determine if it tastes salty, if it's a black mangrove. And I know that sounds a little crazy, but I highly recommend it, and I do it all the time. Last but not least, we have the white mangrove or Laguncularia racemosa. And although they are very salt tolerant, white mangroves typically grow at the highest and driest part of the tidal zone. They may have those peg or prop roots depending on their local conditions, but most of these trees have neither. They're best differentiated from other mangroves by these paddle-shaped, succulent light green leaves, which are rounded at the base and tip and smooth underneath. The other big giveaway is that at the base of each leaf, white mangroves have glands called nectaries, and these excrete sugar and salt. They allow salt to pass through the leaves. And if you also notice on the photo on the left, at the very top of the white mangrove leaf, there is a little notch. And that's a really obvious giveaway that you're looking at a white mangrove. Here in Florida, we have one important mangrove associate, the buttonwood. We have two species, the silver and the green, and these are found in coastal areas, often most upland or inland, but they're also really popularly used in landscaping. So you'll see these a lot in neighborhoods and also parking lots. Now, buttonwoods are not true mangroves because there's no reproductive adaptations or those adaptive root structures, but they really are important in the transitional zone. You can see here in this photo that they have sharply pointed alternating leaves. And at the right edge of the photo, you can see that these leaves are alternating. They're not opposite of one another. Now, I mentioned reproduction just a second ago. And this is where we talk about vivipary, or the reproductive process that mangroves possess. New trees establish themselves further away from the original trees in this process of vivipary. And that's where seeds sprout into torpedo-shaped seedlings called propagules while they're still attached to the parent tree. The sprouts or the propagules then drop into the ground or into the water. When a seedling lands in the water, it may either take root among the other mangrove roots or float with the current until it drifts onto suitable ground. These seedlings or propagules remain viable for long periods of time and can become established after floating as long as 12 months. I wanted to include this photograph on the right because it's a terrific example of our 3 species and their different propagules. The red mangroves have these really long torpedo-shaped or dart-shaped propagules. The black mangrove propagule is smaller. It's lima bean-shaped and about 1.5 inches by 1 inch. And the white mangrove propagules can be as small as a grain of rice. So if you're able to observe all of the propagules, you can also, that's another clue when you're trying to identify what species of mangrove they are. Now, each species of mangrove typically grows in a specific zone along the shoreline. And I really like this graphic because it makes it a little bit easier to visualize. The existence of distinct zones, each dominated by different mangrove species, is often evident in well-developed mangrove swamps or communities. Usually red mangroves grow closest to the water, black mangroves grow a little further upland than the reds, and the whites grow the most landward. It's important to note that buttonwoods are not mangroves as defined by Florida statute. Now, even though that schematic was as if nature had never been interfered with, that is how mangrove forests would develop, I wanted to show an example of where nature breaks the rules. This is a recent example of a mangrove that I found just off of Chapman Field Park in Miami, growing all by its lonesome in the shallow end of Biscayne Bay, about 50 feet of the shoreline. And at a quick glance, can anyone tell what kind of mangrove this is? We have any takers, Ed?
Not yet. So Marcia and Michael and Keisha, I'll say black.
All right, black mangroves, excellent. Because you saw the peg roots, the pneumatophores in the right. This is a black mangrove that's growing about 50 or 60 feet from the shore in the middle of Biscayne Bay, where at all times of day, it's covered by water. So Mother Nature can make her own rules. Now, in terms of mangroves' ecological function, they do a ton of different things. Almost all life on Earth relies directly or indirectly on primary production. In other words, the synthesis of organic compounds through photosynthesis. Mangroves are considered primary producers or autotrophs, the organisms responsible for primary production which form the base of the food chain. Mangroves are highly productive ecosystems with an average above ground net primary production very similar to tropical terrestrial rainforests. Such average numbers mask enormous spatial variation, and actual mangrove primary production is determined by a range of factors, including climate, freshwater input, and nutrient availability. Mangrove forests produce 3.5 tons per acre of leaf litter every year. This decomposed detritus forms the foundation of the mangrove food web. The branches and root system of the mangroves provide protected nursery areas for shellfish, crustacean, and fish. A host of primary consumers, ranging in size from insects to even deer and cattle, feed directly on the trees. Macroalgae and photosynthetic microorganisms growing on roots, fallen tree parts, and the sediment surface also contribute to primary productivity in mangrove systems. Highest productivity is along creek banks and forest edges. Local mangroves are highly productive in small demersal fish and invertebrates that during relatively low water periods become highly concentrated and exploited by waterbird species and game fish. These wetlands also provide critical nesting habitat for waterbirds and nursery habitat for fishery species. Mangrove forests provide primary habitat and predation refuge for thousands of species at all levels of marine food webs, from bacteria to Goliath grouper and herons. A number of spatial guilds for mangrove-associated species have been identified. Guilds are groups of species that utilize the same resources. In this case, they share the same location. The sublittoral or littoral guild utilizes the prop root zone of red mangroves because they provide sessile filter feeding organisms such as tunicates, barnacles, oysters, and mussels with an ideal environment. Mobile organisms such as crabs, shrimp, snails, boring crustaceans, polychaete worms, many species of juvenile fishes, and other transient species also utilize the prop root zone of mangroves as both a predation refuge and feeding area. Mangroves shelter insects that take cover in the dense branches, attracting birds that feed on them. These coastal forests are prime nesting and resting sites for hundreds of shorebirds and migratory bird species, including kingfishers, herons, and egrets. The soft, nutrient-rich soil below the mangrove roots provides habitats for burrowing species such as snails and clams. Other species, such as crabs and shrimp, forage in the fertile mud. Mangroves help improve water quality by extracting excess nutrients and by facilitating the detoxification and storage of pollutants in the sediments. Mangroves can also filter and remove runoff, debris, and pollutants from adjacent uplands. This provides the pollutants from contaminating waters and helps to maintain and improve water quality, as well as protecting the offshore seagrass and coral reef communities. Here in Southeast Florida, it's important to point out that mangroves are part of an interconnected ecosystem. Their productivity and health are closely linked to nearby coastal habitats, including estuarine areas where fresh and saltwater meet, seagrass beds, nearshore hard bottom, and the coral reefs that line our coasts. They also provide food for a number of marine species, including oysters, shrimp, snook, snapper, tarpon, jack, sheepshead, and red drum. Mangroves are sources for the export of organic material into coastal waters. In addition, they enhance the fish biomass on nearby seagrass beds and corals, and other reef-building invertebrates have been found to assimilate near mangrove organic material. Most importantly, 90% of game fish and commercial fish species rely on mangroves during some part of their life. I love everything that the Nature Conservancy does. And this was an infographic that they produced a few years ago outlining natural defenses and their contributions to us on land. Here in Miami, we know that our first line of coastal defense, natural line of coastal defense, is our coral reef system. But next up, we have mangroves, which reduce 66% of wave height, which for us minimizes or lessens the impact of erosion and slows down the risk of flooding. Something that if you all have been joining us for the past few weeks, you've been hearing about is this idea and newer field of study of carbon sequestration. Mangrove forests store massive amounts of carbon estimated at 3.7 pounds per acre per day. That's about 1,300 pounds per acre per year. And the loss of mangrove forests not only releases the stored carbon, but also prevents the further sequestration of carbon. Disturbed mangrove soils release greater than an additional 11 million metric tons of carbon a year. Carbon captured and sequestered from the atmosphere by mangrove trees is stored into leaves, trunks, branches, and the below ground and aerial roots. This is another really strong infographic that shows just how much more storage capability mangroves have than terrestrial trees. A study that came out this year by Dantis et al. Focused in on looking at created salt marshes in Tampa Bay versus more established mangrove forests, and what type of carbon sequestration potential the newer created areas versus the more established forests have. And the study concluded that the greater the age of the system, in this case, the mangrove system, the higher the carbon storage potential. And they concluded that by 2100, greenhouse gas sequestration would increase to about 2.1 metric tons, which is pretty cool. Of course, that's based on the assumption that no mangroves are lost based on the existing forests. For all of these reasons, mangroves are incorporated as a really strong element into this concept that's getting more and more momentum, and that's this concept of living shorelines. And living shorelines are softer or greener approaches to putting things along the coast, along the shore, either in place of or in combination with structures that are traditionally put in that are considered, quote, hard, like seawalls and jetties. Not only do all of these, do living shorelines offer more ecological benefits, they also tend to be less expensive and can hold up to natural phenomena like storms a lot better than hardened structures can. And we have courses, we have a newer Florida Master Naturalist course in coastal shoreline restoration that examines living shorelines in a lot greater detail. But this is something that a lot more cities and counties and municipalities are trying to work into restoration projects and construction projects. Now, it's true that mangroves can be naturally damaged or destroyed, but there's no doubt that human impact has been the most severe. Mangrove and upland habitats in South Florida have been destroyed largely due to urbanization and have resulted in altered shoreline and circulation patterns. These impacts to mangrove forests can be direct, where the mangrove forest is gone and we do not have it anymore, or indirect, where the forest species composition and functions are modified over time. I'm going to ask Ed to launch my second little quiz question. So if you all will go ahead and take your best crack at this. What percentage of mangroves have been lost in Florida since the 1940s, or when heavy development began? Is it A, 27%, B, 54%, C, 86%, or D, 92%? All right, I think we've got everyone, Ed. Nice job, everybody. I'm going to give you that answer in just a second. Thanks for playing once again. Now, in Florida, I think most of us will agree that mangrove shorelines have historically been a prime target for waterfront residential property development activities. There's also been the direct loss of mangrove habitat by conversion of these areas to agricultural urban lands, clear cutting for timber, fuel wood, charcoal, impounding for mosquito control, and conversions to salt ponds for fish and shellfish culture operations. And all of these activities have resulted in the loss of over half of the area occupied by mangroves around the world. Here in Florida, we also have lots of invasive species competition, namely by the Brazilian pepper and Australian pine. And the Florida Marine Research Institute estimates an 86% loss in the state's mangroves since the 1940s. So thank you for your guesses, everybody. All right, we're getting into the home stretch. Welcome to Miami. Now, these next few slides are really just to leave you with some images in your head to think about, and just to think about in terms of where the majority of us live. We live in probably one of the most highly developed counties in the entire state of Florida. And major development of this area began in 1905 with the construction of the government cut inlet. And peak development really started in the 1920s when Baker's Hollover Inlet was dug in 1925. And that resulted in dredge and fill activities at Biscayne Bay, and also the dredging and filling of what used to be the mangrove swamps on Miami Beach. And so as a result, not only have we lost all of these natural habitats, but the circulation and salinity patterns within Biscayne Bay have largely been altered because of this massive amounts of water exchange between the bay and the Atlantic Ocean with the installation of government cut and Baker's Hollow inlets. These are other historical and more current photos, aerial views of both Dinner Key Marina and Coconut Grove, as well as the Miami River. And so I wanted you all just to see these, to really think about how developed we are, how might we be able to integrate mangroves or other soft features into restoration and other projects, especially moving forward, especially as we continue to mitigate and prepare for changes stemming from climate change. As a result of all of these things that we've been looking at today, mangroves are now protected by Florida state statute, which is the Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. This was created in 1991 and updated in 1996, and it's administered by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. What that really means is that any project, whether it be a residential project or commercial development involving either changing the landscape or altering or cutting down mangroves, is highly regulated and requires permitting. For most of the counties in the state of Florida, these activities have to be handled directly through to the Department of Environmental Protection, but Miami-Dade County actually has a delegation to administer the Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act, which means that anyone wanting to develop or take out mangroves or put in mangroves can work directly with Miami-Dade County instead of having to work with Tallahassee. So it gives a slightly, I think, more easy range to be able to work and complete these projects because they're dealing on a more local level. To give you all an idea of what the Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act has resulted in, if mangroves are altered or removed that are not following the conditions of their permit, or activities were committed without a permit, individuals who are held responsible have to pay fines. So you can see that in South Florida, between the Southeast and the South District, we have the highest number of fines. And in our area, the Southeast, we have the highest number of fines. And I don't know where these figures, I don't know, I don't have the access to the report. I'm not sure what the circumstances were that resulted in the totals, but I don't believe that it's because the Southeast District has more mangroves than the South District. My hypothesis would be is that we have more violators. I wanted to give a mention to my colleagues at Miami Eco Adventures because part of their work is engaging the residents and visitors of Miami-Dade County in the natural environments that we have. And they do offer both snorkeling as well as paddle tours. And there are many locations that they have that they can get you into the mangroves. This includes Chapman Field, the Coral Gables Waterway, Crandon Park, Matheson Hammock, and a few others. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. And I want to thank you all very much for joining us on another Friday once again, and leave you with this image. This is me licking that black mangrove leaf that I found in Biscayne Bay last month. And I'm really happy to take your questions, and thank you once again.
That's a really great photo. Thanks everyone for joining. That was a great presentation, Anna. It's now just after 1:30. So if you guys do have to leave, that's no problem. But we will be staying on to answer any questions from you guys. So if you have any questions or comments for Anna, please go ahead and throw them in the chat and I'll read them out. All right, so we have one from Michael. He says, are there any active or planned mangrove plantings going on in South Florida, and how can one get involved?
Actually, Ed, I'm so sorry. Can I punt that over to you for just a second?
Sure. So we obviously, as of right now, it's a lot of these types of situations are kind of on hold. But I do know that there are opportunities with a few different organizations. Sometimes, rare occasions, the county does do plantings. I know the city does as well. But those sorts of those sorts of plantings, they don't happen very frequently. Both of those agencies do have mangrove plantings. I'm not sure if it's they're all public involvement type situations. Another organization I do know sometimes is the Frost Museum through their Museum Volunteers for the Environment. But again, we do a lot of plantings along our coastlines, but they're not always mangroves and they're not always open to the public. But we can definitely share those instances with you once those do resume. Anna, you any comments with that? And then, so Anna had to jump off real quick, but we have another question from Marcia. She says, does plastic debris such as six-pack holders suffocate mangroves? So we do have a lot of instances where marine debris does, impact the growth and obviously the biodiversity within the mangroves and the marine life that do rely upon mangroves. So yes, that is an issue, and that is another thing where the public can be involved. We do often, even Miami Eco Adventures, Anna did mention us, we do our mangrove tours. We also do mangrove cleanups. So again, once our programs get back online, we will be offering mangrove cleanups. So that's a really great way to get involved. And that marine debris, because it's constantly coming in, both through our bay, from the ocean, they constantly get caught up in those mangrove roots. So that's a great question, Marcia. And yes, that's a great opportunity for folks to get involved and not only help mangroves, but help the marine life that live within the mangrove ecosystems. Karina asks, what are some other adaptations to water salinity? So Anna mentioned black mangroves secrete salt through their leaves. How do the others handle salt? So yeah, they do excrete salt through their leaves. Another adaptation that is specifically with the red mangroves, that is it's a theory, something that has been theorized but not proven, but it's called a sacrificial leaf. So oftentimes on the red mangroves, you'll see some leaves that are yellow in color or kind of a dark orange. And it's hypothesized that the plant pumps the excess salt into these dead or dying leaves or weaker leaves, and they'll drop that from the plant as a sacrifice. So that's a pretty interesting thing that has been theorized, and they're doing more research into that. But that is another way. And then also, again, through the root systems, they oftentimes through what are called lenticels, they'll secrete salt through the roots. So yeah, so all these trees do have these adaptations in order to live in such a salty environment. Marcia says, what is the safest way to dispose of six-pack holders? So first and foremost would be, if you can avoid those when you are making your purchases. I know sometimes it's difficult, but sometimes they package them in boxes. But if you do have one, the first thing I would do would be to cut them so that they don't, they're not in a way that in a shape anymore that can get caught around the neck of an animal or caught around a mangrove. So cutting them and then recycling those if you can. Michael asks, how important are mangrove forests to the survival of young American crocodiles? That's a really great question. Crocodiles, especially here in South Florida, do rely upon those estuarine ecosystems, not only for, for hunting a prey, but also for nesting. So we do have a lot of areas, especially in Everglades National Park, and also on the West Coast, we have down in Key Largo, we have the Crocodile National Wildlife Refuge. So those mangrove forests are extremely important, again, both for, their life cycle as well as their nesting. And a lot of those areas that are protected habitats, or that have been established as habitats are preserved. Those areas are mangrove forests. So those are extremely critical to again, American crocodiles are endangered. So those have been set aside as endangered habitat. Any other questions? Sorry, our speaker had to jump off, but if I can answer any other questions for you guys, please let me know. All right. Well, if there's no further questions, again, I just wanted to let everyone know again, thanks for tuning in. This webinar was recorded. We will be sending out a link to the broadcast within the next day or two. So again, if you want to get those topics, the next week's topics, go ahead and email Anna. So it's azangroniz@ufl.edu. And then follow us on social media, again, for information about these. We do a lot of educational posts as well as the topics for next week. And let's all give Anna a round of applause for the great presentation. And we'll hopefully see you guys next week. Please stay safe.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Ed, for pinch hitting for me. I apologize that I had to get off the phone real quick.
No worries. We had some great questions from the audience today.
All right.
All right, guys. Thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Okie doke. Bye, everyone. Thank you.